Welcome to Copenhagenchronicles, a podcast in English about the Danish tales of the past. Okay, so before we begin, let me just make a quick but important disclaimer. The title of this podcast is Gorm the Old, Denmark's first king, with first in quotation, since this is actually not true. Denmark without a doubt had kings before him. The reason why I will not be making a standalone episode about them, like I will with every other king after Gorm the Old, is simply because there's very little material about them. Not only that, but the material we do have is not contemporary Danish sources. It is therefore debatable how reliable these sources are. Even the information I have about Gorm is extremely scant, and based on sources that are, to say the least, questionable. For example, many of the sources I have are based on two writers, the Danish Saxo and the German Adam of Bremen. Both people living way after the time of Gorm, and both with a certain amount of subjectivity. Regardless, this is where most of the information we have about the old kings come from, so this is what I'll be using as a reference as well. The Danish monarchy has existed for over 1,000 years and is one of the oldest in the world. Our current Queen Margaret II can trace her bloodline all the way back to the main character of our podcast today, Gorm. This despite many turbulent events that could have easily disturbed the royal house's pedigree. As you can maybe imagine, 1,000 years is a long time to keep a monarchy running, and it has not been without complications or major changes. The royal lineage can be sorted into 4 different categories: the House of Gorm, the House of Estrisen, the House of Oldenburg, and the House of Glücksburg. While we're not going into detail with every house this episode, it is important to know that the lineage of kings and queens has undergone several changes. The House of Gorm is, not surprisingly, the house in which Gorm the Old belonged to. In fact, it was started by his dad, or alleged dad, Harald I. Harald was a semi-legendary king, meaning that what we know about him is somewhat historically correct, somewhat fiction. According to the, again, semi-fictional and very patriotic chronicle Gesta Danorium, written by Saxo, Harald was the son of Ragnar Lothbrok himself. Yes, that guy from the TV series Vikings. Again, everything pre-Gorm the Old is shrouded in mystery and has very little evidence to back it up. But what is quite literally carved in stone is the existence of Gorm the Old. Here I'm talking about a big old runestone in southeast Jutland called the Yelling Stone, of which there are 2. The Yelling Stones were raised by Gorm the Old and his son Harald Bluetooth. And they are not only proof of their maker's existence, but they also have a massive influence on Danish culture. The bigger of the 2 stones, the one raised by Harald, even has the nickname Denmark's birth certificate. And the smaller stone raised by Gorm has the first mention of Denmark ever in recorded history. No wonder they are present on every Dane's passport. Absolutely nothing is known about the way Gorm grew up, where he grew up, who he grew up with, and what happened in the first half of his life. But what we can do is look at the scarce knowledge we do have about childhood in the Viking Ages, and perhaps draw some similarities to the king. In order to have a childhood in the first place, you'd first have to be lucky enough to survive childhood and the early years of life. Childhood mortality was extremely high compared to today. And there are even sources mentioning how unwanted children were left to die in the elements or be eaten by wild predators. You also stood a risk of becoming a human sacrifice to the gods. We know this because bones of children have been recovered in marshes and wells as water offerings, as water most likely was seen as a gateway into another world. If you did not succumb from disease, being born, or became a sacrifice, you most likely had a short-lived childhood and were probably married early. But this does not mean that childhood was all doom and gloom. It was just different than what we see childhood as today. Although children worked as soon as they were capable, since Vikings were farmers and needed all hands they could get, they also had time for recreational activities. We know this because toys like little ships, dolls, animal figures, and children's swords have been recovered from the time. If Gorm had to partake in that much hard labor, being from a very important and most likely well-off family, is unknown. But perhaps it could be speculated that he had it a bit easier than the average Danish child. When Gorm came of age, he married Thyra, who was the daughter of English King Ethelred. Or was she really the daughter of Harald Clark of Jutland? Her origins are honestly one big mess, and it's currently impossible to figure out where she actually came from. Anyway, they got married, and according to Saxo, Thyra demanded her new husband to not consummate the marriage right away, but to wait 3 days in a separate home until he had a dream vision of having a child with her. In other stories, Gorm didn't have to sleep in another house, but he put his sword between them in bed to create a barrier and a guarantee he wouldn't be up to any funny business. Respecting his bride's wishes, he did indeed keep his hands to himself, and on the first night he had a dream of 2 birds flying from Thyra's lap and landing in Gorm's hands. They once again took off, only for the smallest to return covered in blood. For some reason, Thyra thought that this dream was a sign that their marriage would indeed grant her children, and sure enough, shortly after the marriage, the couple had 2 sons, Harald and Knud. Overall, Thyra and Gorm had a very long and, according to some sources, good and respectful relationship. A power couple, some might call them today. From what is written on the runestone Gorm raised in the end of the 900s, especially Gorm truly loved Thyra. It says, King Gorm made this monument in memory of Thyra his wife, Denmark's adornment. Gorm was a fierce protector of paganism and the old gods, and he denounced any attempt of Christianizing his country and his people. Which is probably why Saxo gave this less than nuanced description of the king, seeing as Saxo was living in a very Catholic Denmark. Now, King Gorm, a man constantly hostile towards Christianity, became fixated on depriving the Christians of any honor, as if they were the worst of all humans. Anyone confessing to the faith, he tormented in any possible way, following tirelessly with cruel words. Adam of Bremen, who just so happened to also be Christian, followed with the same sentiment about the king. He was, I must say, a horrible worm and hostile towards the Christian people. He counted on completely eradicating Christianity in Denmark, expelled God's priests from his country, and even killed many in much torment. But these descriptions of Gorm being a horrible and merciless worm of a king do not exactly match with other sources. In Icelandic sources, for example, and please excuse my Icelandic, the Havsteen, we hear about the king as a heroic Viking hero. But there's little doubt that Gorm was a king that stuck to the old traditions, especially those of keeping in touch with his pagan beliefs and the old gods. Whether Thyra was of the same understanding is unknown. As with Gorm, very few things are known for a fact about the queen. Despite this, her significance and influence in her own time, but also in the time after her, is indisputable. She was a symbol of nationalism in the 1800s. In the 1800s, people believed that Thyra in her time gave orders to raise Dannevirke, a system of Danish fortifications in now northern Germany that belonged to the Danish kingdom at the time. Dannevirke was an important protection against enemies from the south. But archaeological finding has now proved that the building materials are much older than Thyra. We're talking hundreds of years. Alas, her name was still used for newspapers, associations, and was depicted as Denmark's protector in poems and songs. And perhaps Gorm was in his right to protect Denmark from the foreign Christian beliefs. Up until around year 900, paganism was dominant in the north. Danes believed in the one-eyed and all-knowing Odin, Thor, the hammer-wielding thunder god, and Freya, the goddess of love and fertility, amongst many others. Changing this belief to only one omnipresent god must have been a foreign and perhaps confusing thought for the king. Why worship a god that goes against what Danes had lived with for so many years? Vikings had a much different relationship with their gods than that of the rest of the Catholic Europe. While the Viking gods were of course powerful, and Vikings both feared and respected them, the gods were also much more human and perhaps relatable than that of the Christian all-knowing and all-seeing god. Their gods had faults, got jealous, fought, drank, made mistakes, and fell in love. Certainly things that a monk could never imagine his god ever do. The Vikings sacrificed many animals, humans, and belongings for their gods, while for the Christian god you simply had to pray. And much of what drove the unrelenting pillaging all around Europe was the idea that a great reward awaited whomever died in the battlefield, everlasting life in Valhalla, whereas the Christian god asked not to kill nor steal. Outrageous! But the Danes did eventually become Christianized by none other than Gorm's own son, Harald Bluetooth, who later, of course, became the king. But what happened to the other son, Knud? Well, you might remember Gorm's dream before his and Thyra's wedding, the one about only the little bird returning, but covered in blood. This dream was a realistic forewarning about what was to come and Knud's fate. During an expedition to Dublin, Harald and Knud along with their warriors would pass time playing games during the evenings. During one of these games, a Dublin archer shot Knud fatally in the chest. While Knud was dying, he asked the games to continue as if nothing happened. If all of his men were to suddenly panic, the Irish would know they had hit him, and they would know the Danes would be without their leader. According to legend, the Irish never noticed, and the siege on Dublin continued. When the word of Knud's death reached Denmark, Thyra was the first to know, and this is probably all for the better, since Gorm had sworn to kill whichever messenger were to bring him the news of his favorite son's death. Thyra, being the smart woman that she was, instead dressed herself in mourning attire. When Gorm saw, he said, "Are you bringing me the news of my son's death?" And Thyra answered, "You brought the news, not I." Gorm, being a man of his words, thus killed the messenger. Well, at least the legend says he died shortly after of grief. But this story is probably not true. Remember the Yelling stones? Well, the stone Gorm raised was in memory of Thyra, so this indicated that Thyra died before Gorm. Yeah, it's a bit of a mess when very few sources about these individuals exist. But it's a pretty good story, right? So, Gorm dies, most likely before Thyra, and also most likely before he actually gets old. The reason he got the name Gorm the Old is more a reference to the time in which he ruled, the old times, which means that the name was given to him way after his days. When Gorm was alive, he was known as Gorm the Horrible or Gorm the Lazy. Not exactly the greatest names to be remembered by. Old is at least a little bit better than that. Since Gorm was as pagan as they come, he did not receive a Christian burial when he died. He was instead laid in a burial mound in Olling called the Northern Mound. Vikings' burial traditions were manifold and different depending on time, placement, and status. If you were of lower status, perhaps just a common peasant, you'd be buried in a hole in the ground. But you would always be buried with several of your belongings, so you wouldn't need anything in the afterlife. While male graves had such items as weapons, tools, and hunting dogs, female graves had jewelry, tools for cloth making, and for the household. But if you were of higher status, a jarl perhaps, or even a king, your burial would be much different. There are reports of cremation fires both on land and carts and on boats, although there has never been found actual archaeological signs of these types of rituals. In 922, the Arabian traveler Ahmed ibn Fadlan stumbled upon Swedish Vikings in Russia, where he observed how Vikings buried their jarl. He was laid in a temporary coffin for 10 days, while new clothes were made for him. An enslaved woman volunteered to sacrifice herself and follow the jarl into death. While she waited for the day of her death, 2 women guarded her and made sure she had plenty of alcohol, probably to keep the worst of fears away from her as she waited. When the day of burial came, the jarl's ship was pulled ashore and put on a wooden platform, and on the ship was a small tent covering a bed in which the jarl was laid. Then the angel of death stepped forward, as she was responsible for the ritual. The enslaved woman was drunk, as 2 men carried her aboard and placed her in the tent with the jarl. The angel of death pulled out a rope and strangled her, and in the very end she plunged a knife into her chest, making sure she was indeed dead. The men surrounding the ship hit their shields hard in a drumming motion in order to drown out the woman's screams. And then it got silent. Now, it was only the sparks from the flames that could be heard. Although we do not know exactly how Gorm the Old was buried, we know that his body, at least for a while, was laid to rest in the burial mound. And I say for a while because when his son Harald Christianized the Danes, he decided that it would be best for his father to have a proper Christian burial, and he buried Gorm under the newly built Olling church. Probably not something Gorm would have liked one bit. And the remains of a man was indeed found under the church. Whether this is Gorm or not is still up for debate. The height of the person is 172 centimeters, which is quite tall for the time, and this fits the description of Gorm's physical appearance being quite large. The age of the body when it died is estimated to be between 40 to 50 years, which again establishes that Gorm, if this indeed is Gorm, was not really that old when he died. In conclusion, there is very little we can say about the old king with certainty. The only things we know for a fact is that he was a king, his wife's name was Thyra, and he had a son named Harald who took over the throne after him. Now the question is, where do you go in Copenhagen if you want to experience just a little bit of Gorm's life? Well, since we have no idea if Gorm even went near Copenhagen, that was most likely not much more than a settlement or a small town at the time. Please listen to the episode on how Copenhagen came to be for more on that. There isn't much to see in the city related to Gorm. The best bet is to give the Natural History Museum a visit. They have an excellent exhibition on Vikings that is highly interactive and shows many aspects of what life was like when Gorm ruled the country. Now, if you were to take a train outside Copenhagen, you could visit the Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde, another city that was of great importance in the Viking Age. And if you want to see a real Viking fortress, or at least the remains hereof, you can visit Trelleborg in Slagelse, a fortress which dates back to the time of Gorm's son Harald Bluetooth's days. And last but not least, if you truly want to feel like a Viking, you can visit the reconstructed Viking village in Albertslund and Frederikssund and observe the Viking way of life. Thank you very much for listening to Copenhagen Chronicles. A quick disclaimer. Although I'm history interested, I am no historian. But I do everything in my power to get the right sources and get the story straight. If you have any suggestions for the next episode, please let me know. My contact information is in the description box below the podcast. That's also where you'll find my sources and articles I used for this episode. Oh, and please remember to rate and share this podcast with friends and family. That would help me out a lot. Thank you. Until next time.